Well, in the last session, we covered CW and digital communications, and I didn't get any questions from anyone, so I guess everybody caught on pretty good. Any rate, tonight we're going to cover two topics. This one in an emergency, and the other one was let's see. The next topic will be Skywave excitement. That's where you really get into that HF operation, and you get some DX and make a lot of contacts. And we're entering into Sunspot Cycle 25 right now. And although the Cycle 24 was rather weak, they're also expecting Cycle 25 to be rather weak as well. But as it gets towards the peak, you're going to really find a lot of activity on the HF bands for about 3 years. You're going to hear stations from all over the world. And that's going to be right at the peak of the cycle. So expect to start really hearing a lot of DX stations, especially on 10 meters and 15 meters, and even 6 meters in the next 3 to 5 years, probably when it's really going to start up. And then it'll be there for 2 or 3 years. All right, we're going to get started with in an emergency. It has to do with emergency communications. And my computer is slow here. And I'm going to get my book so that I can reference some of these questions effectively. Some of the questions last night, or some of the slides kind of threw me off with the digital stuff and not being all that familiar with digital myself, although I have operated digital a little bit. Let's see. We got to be very careful when we're using our radios for emergency communications. So let's start off here with G2B12. One night you're tuning around the 20-meter band and you hear a maritime mobile ham calling for help on 14.150. You got to remember that is outside your general class limits to operate on 14.150. But you are allowed to handle a distress call and save some lives at sea if no one else comes back to them. I mean, this is good, if this is a life and death situation and you're a general class licensee and it's being broadcast on a frequency that legally under normal circumstances you do not have access to or are not allowed to communicate on, in a life or death situation, all bets are off. So as long as the distress signal is a matter of life and safety or immediate protection of property, you're pretty much good to go with almost any power level and any frequency. But to do so, you need to also keep an accurate log. So make certain that communications qualifies as an actual emergency. And before you head out on your adventure, pre-plan, pre-program the frequencies in use in your expected travel area that you could hear your call for help. Any active frequency would be a good spot to place a distress call. Do not rely on police, medical, or fire frequencies because most are protected with digital coded inputs that would not be able to decode your signal. Rather, rely on normal, active, amateur radio communication frequencies. So dealing with particular frequencies, like I have a mobile HF rig in my truck, or it's not there now, but sometimes when I travel, I'll put the mobile HF into the car or the truck. And I can also put it on scan and scan an entire band. And it's pretty nice, especially when you're traveling in areas where there's no repeaters, very little VHF or UHF activity, HF does come in handy, especially driving in areas of the Midwest. And we were driving through Quebec and New Brunswick up to those areas. And there's a lot of wilderness areas up there. But it was kind of nice because I could talk to people on 20 meters, even 40 meters, and while driving down the road, even though there was no repeater around to operate VHF. So as far as what frequency to use, stick with the regular amateur bands, and if you're in distress, you can place a distress call for help on the bands, and hopefully someone will hear you. So as far as what to do, if you're communicating with another amateur station, you should act immediately to handle a station in distress. Find out who is in distress, where they're located, and exactly what assistance may be needed. If it's a boat, find out how many persons are on board and instruct everyone to put on their personal flotation device. And then, of course, you would notify the Coast Guard in that case. I have a boat, and a lot of boats these days are equipped with marine frequency radios, VHF radios. I have one in my boat, and mine also has GPS built into the radio itself, and it has a distress button. And that is a digital distress button that the Coast Guard monitors. And whenever, if you should be in a distress situation, I can push that button and it automatically sends out an SOS signal on the frequency that is monitored by the Coast Guard. And one of the things that's necessary to do, once I push that button, I also need to tune into channel 16 on the marine frequencies, which is the emergency frequency for marine communications. And because more than likely the Coast Guard will identify my boat, they'll know exactly where I am. They'll know exactly what my boat name is. And if they need more information, I mean, it doesn't give you any information like whether it's a medical emergency or taking on water or anything like that. But being able to provide voice communications, if you have the ability to, before the boat goes down, to communicate with the Coast Guard to tell them exactly what your issue is. Same thing on amateur radio. You want to make sure that you know who is in distress, where they're located, and what the nature of the emergency might be. Okay, your new general class ham station is not to be used for routine news gathering for your local television station. And of course, remember, we did cover this in the technician class license. So, so this should not really be anything new as far as what the legalities are in doing this. To disseminate public information to the general public is usually a no-no. But in a disaster situation where you're the only ham on the scene, or maybe you have a few hams on the scene, there's nobody else around, there's no police, no fire, nothing, and a bridge has just collapsed, it would be permissible for you to contact your local news agency and make this safety a human life transmission, so motorists don't accidentally fly off the span. And you can also keep the news agency updated until somebody else comes that has that prime responsibility, and then you can turn it over to them. Okay, RACES, or the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, is a public service by licensed amateur radio operators to provide volunteer communications to government agencies in time of extraordinary need. FEMA provides planning, guidance, and technical assistance for establishing RACES and or a RACES unit of licensed amateur radio operators at the state and local government levels. And only licensed amateur radio operators with a current RACES authorization may be the control operator at a RACES station. As part of disaster relief, FEMA in their playbook for disaster response includes amateur radio communications as part of that. And the advantage that amateur radio provides FEMA and other disaster agencies is that they have the ability to intercommunicate with the different agencies and different departments around, because by posting, amateurs with, say, the fire, police, whatever command posts are set up by local and regional and federal authorities, amateur radio has that ability to intercommunicate and provide health and welfare traffic in and out of a disaster scene or location. Okay. Well, here we have a picture of amateur radio has a long friendly history with military and civilian services through Mars, RACES, and other similar auxiliary services. Here you have a ham operator and pilot Jeff N6JSV, and they're ready for a helicopter disaster drill for the city of for city RACES training, and they're using APRS handheld radios. And that looks a lot like Gordon West over there in that other seat there. So you may be called upon if you're an Aries or a RACES affiliated station. You may be called upon to provide communications in just about any particular situation. You could be flying with someone. I know the Civil Air Patrol did a presentation at one of our ham club meetings one time at a different club that I was a member of. And they were actually looking to enlist ham radio operators in their program and become a part of the Civil Air Patrol and provide communications for whatever situation that they encounter or in need of. So the FCC has the ability to actually restrict normal frequency operations of amateur stations, especially participating in RACES. But during a time of war, when the president exercises his war emergency powers, RACES may become the only communications allowed via amateur radio. All other non-RACES ham operators would be ordered to stop transmitting, and only RACES operators could remain on the air. And I do believe that that was implemented during World War II. There were no restrictions, of course, during the Vietnam conflict and Korean conflict. But during World War II, I think the War Emergency Powers Act was enacted, and amateur radio communications was severely restricted. All right, now we're going to get into some questions. Like I said, this was kind of short. The next segment, Skywave, is going to be about 90 slides, but we should be well within the time frame tonight, and we won't be going over. So when is an amateur station allowed to use any means at its disposal to assist another station in distress? Just think back to that first time there, that first slide we were talking about. And at any time during an actual emergency. It has to be an actual emergency affecting life and property. So what frequency should be used to send a distress call? And in this case, it can be whichever communication or whichever frequency has the best chance of communicating the distress message. What is the first thing you should do if you're communicating with another amateur station and you hear a station in distress break in? Again, this is an emergency, and you need to make sure that you take the time to acknowledge the station in distress and determine what assistance may be needed, the who, what, where, and notify the proper authorities. If it's maritime, you want to contact the Coast Guard. All the others, I know that I've handled situations where um, the emergency was called out, and it was by another ham, of course. And they were involved in an accident, and this was before the advent of cell phones being so prolific. And he had his HF rig in his car, and it was out in the Midwest somewhere. Can't remember exactly where it was, but it was out in the Midwest. So I had to find out where he was and call the local county or the state police. I can't remember which one exactly I called, but I called one of the authorities out there to do that. So it could be you never know what situation you could run into, but you always want to make sure that you take the time to acknowledge any station in distress and to help them if you can. It's also relaying. It was kind of interesting here not too long ago, several years ago. There was a situation where there was a maritime station in distress, and there was a relay station there. A relay had to happen between a station in California that was picking it up. There was a ham in Oregon where the Coast Guard was for the which was the closest place to the maritime that ship that was in distress, and there had to be a relay. The Oregon station could not hear the distress call, but could hear the person in California and picking up the distress call. So he relayed the information up to the Oregon station. The Oregon station contacted the Coast Guard there, and they were able to. Was that call received from there into here? Um, there was one. There's been a couple of these over the recent years. I guess within the past 10 years that's happened. I think there was another one that came into this location. It's somewhere here on the East Coast. Somebody picked it up, but I have to look that up again. That was kind of interesting. Anyway, back to what we're doing here. Which of the following must be true before amateur stations may provide communications to broadcasters for dissemination to the public? Again, we're not really allowed to do any news gathering or things like that. But in the instance of where you have a situation that involves immediate safety of human life and protection of property, the communications must be directly related to that. And there must be no other means of communication reasonably available before or at the time of the event. You're on a scene somewhere and there's nobody else around, and you need to get information out. Frankly, for me, I would be calling the local police department and tell them, hey, there's a bridge out, and let them take care of the communications to the news organizations. Um, I don't even see where this is an issue in here, but The FCC will allow it in these instances. Who may be the control operator of an amateur station transmitting in RACES to assist relief operations during a disaster? Okay, only a person holding an FCC issued amateur operator license is the correct answer for this. This can be a little bit confusing because B might look like the correct answer, but that's not necessarily true. But the person holding an FCC issued amateur radio license may be the control operator of an amateur station transmitting in RACES to assist relief operations during disaster. One of those things you just have to plug in your mind there. Yep. So when may the FCC restrict normal frequency operations of amateur stations participating in RACES? Well, we covered that pretty easily. And that's when the president's war emergency powers have been invoked. And then only RACES stations are allowed. Yep, D. Okie dokie. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Gonna stop sharing, and then you're gonna see me and all my junk in the back because I haven't closed the magic curtain. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. I am the great and powerful Oz. So, and that's me. Gosh, I love that movie. It's actually my second favorite movie. Predominantly because for the era when it was made, the special effects are just, I think, extraordinary given the time when that was produced. And my PowerPoint's taking its time here. Oh boy. Fantastic movie. I love The Wizard of Oz. Yes, indeed. I think it came out at the same time that, what was the, Gone with the Wind? I thought it came out about the same time that Gone with the Wind came out. But frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. Oops, did I say that? I shouldn't say that. Well, we're not on the air, so there we go. All right. Skywave excitement. Here we go. We're going to get into some HF stuff. All righty. Well, when you get on the air, you're going to experience a lot of different propagation conditions. And if you look there on page 81, if you also look on the opposite page there on page 80 of your book, it talks a little bit about the effect of the ionosphere on radio waves and talks about the different layers of ionosphere that circle the Earth. And in particular, we're going to talk about, it's going to talk about a little bit what's called the MUF, or the maximum usable frequency for particular times of the day and particular bands. So if you ever hear somebody say MUF, they're talking about the conditions for a particular band on a particular given time, whether it be day or night. So you see there in that little picture, New Jersey sends a signal out on 20 meters. It bounces off the ionosphere and bonks somebody on the head there in California. I don't know if that actually what happens, but oh well. So here we're talking about the F2 region. So the higher the altitude of the ionospheric region refracting the high frequency radio waves, the greater the radio range. And the F2 region is the highest layer and gives the longest propagation. The F2 layer, that's like way up there. The F2 region is our highest reflective ionospheric region, or approximately 250 miles up. This gives worldwide signals their longest bounce, generally about 2,500 miles. Yep, absolutely. The ionosphere is influenced by ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Maximum ultraviolet radiation occurs when the sun is at its highest elevation overhead. Ionospheric layers reach their maximum height at the same time. I'm trying to follow along here as much as I can. Okay, next we're going to talk about critical angle. So this is what critical angle means. Have you ever skipped stones on a lake? If thrown at too great an angle to the surface of the water, the stone will not skip, but rather penetrate into the water. Radio waves in the ionosphere act about the same. There is a point, which is the highest takeoff angle, that cannot be exceeded, or a radio wave will not reflect back to Earth. So just remember highest takeoff angle. It is the makeup of the ionosphere that determines the highest takeoff angle that will refract a high frequency signal back to Earth. And you can play with different antennas all day long, but with magic refractive ionosphere, it's the number one key to a signal that can be heard around the world. So if it doesn't refract, it just skips off out into outer space, and somebody out there in Alpha Centauri or some other solar system or even galaxy might hear your radio wave, and they wonder, who is that? This just is a little chart that kind of shows a little bit about the different layers. So if your transmitter frequency is above critical frequency, transmission goes through the ionosphere. And there you see 144 megahertz, the 2-meter frequency, just kind of shooting off out into nowhere. And the different layers affecting different frequencies. So the 80 and 75 meter band, along with the 40-meter band, they're good for short uh, distance communications. They're especially good at nighttime. You get a little bit longer communication out of 80 and 40 at nighttime, but for daytime use, they're good for really short local communications. Just kind of gives you an idea of how the layers act on the different bands. Here we are, MUF, the maximum usable frequency, peaks during the day and the morning hours to the east for working Europe, and in the afternoon and evening hours to the west for working Asia. And this is the fun of working ham radio skywaves. The ionosphere and the maximum usable frequency will constantly give us excitement if we just keep tuned in. Sometimes I wish I had a little bit more time to spend on HF, but I don't. Okay, frequencies below the MUF and above the LUF are bent back to Earth by the ionosphere. So for maximum range, you actually want to operate as close to MUF as possible. You know, what band is and what frequencies are operating the best for longer communications at a particular given time. Okay, let's see. There is a reliable way to determine if the MUF is high enough to support skip propagation, and in particular for frequencies between 14 and 30 megahertz. So, is there a particular band open to the rest of the world? And if you spin that big knob on the front of your radio and listen to what you hear, if it's full of signals, the band is open to somewhere in the world. If you spin the knob and all you hear is a couple of local hams yakking back and forth, the absence of activity generally indicates the band is not propagating very far. And we do encounter some dead bands quite often, unfortunately. We're getting into hurricane, and there is the Hurricane WatchNet operates on two frequencies in the 20-meter band and the 40-meter band. And sometimes the propagation just isn't there. But the reason for the Hurricane WatchNet is because those hurricanes are going to come in and they're going to hit the islands, and a lot of times the first communications out of any given location, like one of the islands, is going to be on ham radio. So that's particularly what the Hurricane WatchNet does, and it provides certain statistics to the hurricane center about conditions and what's happening in a given location if a ham radio operator is on the air at the time. So, at any rate, listening to the Northern California DX Foundation beacons at 14.1, if you know a little bit about CW and keep track of precise time, you'll know which part of the world is coming in on 20 meters and higher by listening to the beacons on the following frequencies. We talked a little bit about the beacons before. So here is some of the frequencies that you can listen to. They are listed in the book on page 83. And if you tune around to those frequencies and you hear those beacons coming in from whatever part of the world they're transmitting from, you'll know that the band is open during those times. So each beacon transmits its CW call sign on a rotational basis, followed by 4 1-second dashes. The call sign and first dash are sent at 100 watts, and the second dash at 10 watts, the third dash at 1 watt. So if you can hear the last dash at 100 milliwatts, then you know that that band is hot and open. And I don't know of any ham shack that doesn't have a computer in it these days, because there's a lot of information you can do and find out online. And there are, if you go up to qrz.com, let's see if I can bring that in here real quick. I want to show you a little chart real quick. There is a propagation chart. Let me kind of bring this over here to share it. Right here is a little propagation chart that kind of shows up, has particular information on it. And these are updated. Of course, this is, updated Tuesday at this time. That's UTC time, by the way. But it kind of tells you how the conditions of the bands are and gives you other pertinent information right there. So as far as HF conditions are concerned, at the current time, 80 and 40 is fair during the day and good at night. And you have the 30 to 20 meter bands being kind of fair, and the rest of the bands are like they're tanked out. There's nothing there. But you can keep an eye on that information, and it can be quite helpful to determine what might be going on as far as Skywave is concerned. There's another website. I don't know it quite offhand. There's another place where you can find out what the current VHF propagation conditions are. We'll get into that a little bit later on, but that has to do with a totally different type of propagation other than Skywave. And I think we talked a little bit about it at the in the technician license course. So the term lowest attenuation means least amount of signal fading. The trick is to try to operate on the highest high frequency ham band that gives you skywave propagation to somewhere else in the country or the world. Operating just below the MUF will lead to some extraordinary crystal clear communications. Okay. Getting a signal halfway around the Earth is a ham radio tradition, but there are plenty of things to consider when attempting to make a contact. Your solar activity, day or night, fall or summer, and how far away the other station is located. So, when you look at the question there for this one, what factor or factors affect the MUF? It gives you several choices, and all those choices are correct uh, as far as how they affect the MUF. The E layer is between 50 and 90 miles up. Because it's closer to Earth, high frequency waves don't bounce as far as they do off of the F layer. E skip is usually about 1,200 miles. During the summertime, sporadic E may sometimes give you a little bit of a short skip for as little as 600 miles. And I'll tell you, the 10-meter band, if there is sporadic E going on at the time, what we call sporadic E, the E layer being particularly active, you might find yourself in some very good 10-meter communications. And I tell you, if you listen to the upper end of 10 meters, um, you'll maybe run into a couple of 10-meter repeaters up there in the upper end, and those can really help you out. I mean, I was hearing um, a station, a repeater down in Texas, and there was a station in trying to think. I think it was in Nova Scotia. It's either Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. It was a Canadian station. I could not hear him direct, but he was making it into that repeater in Texas, and so was I, and we were talking. That was a few years ago, and that was quite interesting because the sporadic E was there, and then all of a sudden, after about, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes of listening to the repeater and other people, it just dropped out. So now that you're upgrading from tech to general, don't abandon all the excitement on 6 meters. In fact, your new general class privileges on 10 meters will help you forecast an upcoming 6-meter band opening. Making contacts on skywaves on 10 meters with stations less than 300 miles away can indicate an extremely strong sporadic E cloud out there in the ionosphere. So E-skip on 6 meters and maybe even 2 meters will more than likely be possible within the next half hour. And yeah, you want to keep an eye out on that. And um, good information to know if you're tuning around the 10-meter band and all of a sudden you're hearing a lot of stations and they're 300, 500, 600 miles away. Keep an eye on the 6-meter band because that will shift and the 6-meter band could open up, and you might find yourself talking to somebody out in California, maybe. Who knows? The D layer. There's D, then F, or D, then E, then F, F1, F2. So there is an order. So the D layer is the closest to the surface of the Earth. And during daylight hours, the D layer is usually responsible for absorbing ham radio medium frequency skywave signals. Medium frequency being 160 meters, basically. Um, there's a little chart that kind of gives you an idea of about how far up and whether they're active or not. F layer in the summer really isn't so much active, but it includes the F1 and F2. And in the winter, it kind of drops down to about 90 to 150 at night, 90 to 250. So you can follow that chart a little bit. 160 meters, if you have the ability to put up an antenna for 160 meters, can be quite interesting. It is quite active, especially in the wintertime at night. Um, it's not so active in the summertime, mainly because of the atmospheric conditions. But there is some activity during summertime on 160, but not as much as there is in the winter. Do, 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 do. So this is talking about the ionospheric layer that is most absorbent of long propagation signals during daylight hours. So during the day, the D layer hinders distant signals. So let's see. Here's an example of what you can do to your signal. The 40-meter band is a great one for 500-mile daylight skywave contacts. And even though they may fade in and out a little bit, they are almost always there from sunup to around 4 p.m. local time. And after 4 p.m., the D layer associated with absorption begins to disappear and the 40-meter band begins to go long. So the people you were talking with at 500 miles will disappear. And the next thing you know is you're hearing stations a couple thousand miles away. That was my biggest contention about the 40-meter band. There were a lot of broadcast stations over in Region 1 and in Region 3, but mostly Region 1, that, as far as I was concerned, encroached on the 40-meter band, the upper part of it at least. And so 40 meters was essentially to me useless. It's a lot different these days. There's not as many shortwave stations out there broadcasting. So, excuse the noise, I have a creaky chair. So, getting on 40 meters, you can make some good contacts a long way away. Okay, the darn D layer is what he's calling it, does more harm than good to medium and high frequency signals. During daylight hours, during the day, single sideband and CW operations on 160 and 80 meters are confined to ground wave coverage, and on 40 meters, daytime skip distances are generally no greater than 600 miles because the D layer is absorbing MF and HF signals. So that D layer, I mean, 80 and 160 are pretty much useless during the day. And another little pictorial here that kind of gives you an idea of radio wave propagation. Study that a little bit. I think that is in your book on page 86. All right, the term LUF, or lowest usable frequency, refers specifically to stations attempting skywave contact. If you and a buddy are separated by 500 miles and want to stay in touch on the 75 or 80 meter ham band using a specific frequency, you may find that early morning and evening contacts are loud and clear, while attempts at noon result in no contact on that frequency. And that's because at noon, the LUF has become many megahertz higher due to changes in the ionosphere from the effects of the sun. So your chosen frequency is now lower than the LUF, but hang around because the LUF will begin to drop quickly around sundown and your contact will be restored. I have a friend of mine in Temple Hills, Maryland, and we've been trying to establish a schedule on 40 meters for a long time, but we're just not getting in there at the right time that is convenient to either one of us at the same time. Okay, during the daylight hours, the lowest usable frequency for skywave contact may be around 3 megahertz. And this means the 160-meter band, which is just under 2 megahertz, will not be usable for daylight skywave contacts because they are completely absorbed by the ionosphere. But as soon as the sun goes down, hang on for some great DX contacts. There's quite a bit of activity around 1850. Yeah, 1.850 megahertz. There is a group, there's some people that hang around exactly at 1.9 megahertz. There's another group at 1930. Um, there's a few of them on there. If you listen, tune around, if your ability to tune in 160 meters, there's some interesting conversations going on there, and they're all mostly local though. Man, this cough is coming back. I must be talking too much. All right, slide 23. When the lowest usable frequency exceeds the maximum usable frequency, HF radio communications along a specific ionospheric signal path disappears. And this sometimes occurs with increased geomagnetic activity from sunspots. Stand by while I cough. In your book, on page 87, there's a little Elmer help there about medium wave. Take a look at that, read over it a little bit. It gives a little bit of an explanation of MUF and medium frequencies. Okay, scatter communications, and it's sometimes called backscatter. And this is a type of signal that can be detected at a distance too far for ground wave propagation, but too near for normal skywave propagation. Sometimes called backscatter. It's one way to reach a station, and that is in that zone of no reception, or the skip zone. When Gordo communicates from Southern California to Seattle, Seattle, San Francisco is in his skip zone and will not receive his signals. But if he aims his beam antenna west toward Hawaii, some of his signal is backscattered into the Bay Area, giving him communications to a station that is too far for ground wave and too close for normal sky waves. So that's really what skip communications is. It skips over an area. And again, this is another reason why you want to listen. If you're on HF and you want to listen to a frequency, um, you may be in that zone where you can hear someone, and but you're only going to hear one side. You're not going to hear the other person, and so you need to make sure that the frequency is clear. Mm. There's another little picture of what backscatter is. It kind of gives you a bit of a pictorial of that. You can see where the signal fades out going up here, but he's aiming the antenna. If he's going this way, he's skipping over this area. What if he turns that beam antenna different, and it hits off the ionosphere there? It might send a signal coming back down into this area, and then it'll also go over station 2, and station 2 won't hear him. So during periods of scatter communications, only a fraction of the original signal is scattered back to those stations that are too far for ground wave reception, yet too close for the main part of your signal that is being reflected by the ionosphere. So the station in your skip zone gets only a very weak incoming skywave signal. And I think that's kind of what happens to the communication that we try to establish between me and my friend down in Temple Hills, Maryland. And I think we're both getting a little bit of backscatter because we can hear stations that are a little bit further away and we're not able to hear each other very well. The wavy sound of HF scatter signals, especially backscatter, is caused by the signal being reflected back through several radio wave paths, creating a multipath distortion. And that does occur. You can get multipath distortion. In that little picture there, it says your HF transceiver may include the 6 meter, 2 meter, and 440 bands, and 6 meters being the magic band can offer unusual and surprising propagation. Don't forget the DX portion of 2 meters, far away from the madding crowd where the still small voice of weak signal operation prevails. If you have an opening and 2 meters is active, getting on sideband 2 meters can yield some really surprising results as far as how far you can communicate using single sideband on 2 meters. If you choose a frequency slightly greater than the MUF, you can sometimes take advantage of the ionosphere to scatter your communications to an area that normally would not hear radio wave reflection from the ionosphere. High frequency scatter communications bounce a portion of your signal off of densely ionized patches in the ionosphere. And since the ionosphere is constantly in motion, the signals will fade in and out, much like ocean waves, resulting in a wavering sound. So now we're going to get into a little bit of that azimuthal, what do they call it? Azimuthal map charts, things of that sort. Man. Long-range communications do not necessarily go in straight lines. When we navigate our signals around the world, we need a chart that takes into account the curvature of the Earth and where we are located. So an azimuthal map shows your ham shack at the center of the Earth and will help you determine the shortest path between your station and that rare DX station. There you have a picture of it on page 89. Now, there is something called long path. Long path is kind of interesting because if you're unable, let's say you have a beam antenna, if you're unable to actually choose that short distance, that path, the shortest distance, the fastest way to anything is the shortest, most straight line. If by chance you can't reach someone through that short distance, there's something called long path. And that's turning your beam the opposite direction and going around the opposite side of the Earth. And your signal may bounce off the ionosphere several times before it reaches back to you. And sometimes you can even hear yourself, hear an echo of yourself coming back. That's very rare, but it can happen. So, anyway, your azimuthal maps are really most useful if you have a beam antenna. There it is. Oh, that's what it says. Operators with a beam antenna will use a map like this and determine short path and long path headings. Okay, let's see. We're at G3B01. So you might receive a signal via two paths, one short and one long. And if you have the audio course, I don't know if it's on the CD or not, that comes with the book, but check the CD and see if it has that information in there. Hearing the distinctive sound of some simultaneous short path and long path reception. So incoming signals will have a well-defined echo because the short path signal is coming to you from a much closer distance than the long path signal coming all the way around the globe. And the echo you hear is caused by the difference in time it takes the signal to reach you via long path and short. Might want to get into moon bounce too. All right, some ionospheric conditions may let you to establish better communications with the distant stations on general class worldwide frequencies over a long path around the world rather than over the direct short path. So if you hear the station with an echo, try turning your beam antenna 180 degrees in the opposite direction from the short path direction to see whether or not the station will come in better on the long path. Okay, the sunspot cycle peaks approximately every 11, really 12 years. In this case, they're talking about 11 years. So uh, we are really not on current solar cycle 24 and just beginning to slide down the backside because remember, this course started about 4 years ago. And back then we were on the downward slide uh, of number 24. However, um, number 25 is pretty much just beginning at this point. We may be about a year into it, I think, at this time. So the peak took place in 2014, 2015, but for the next 5 years, expect long range F2 skip on 6 meters and 10 meters to subside. But every summer, we will continue to get 6 meter and 10 meter short skip E layer excitement, sporadic E. On the lower bands like 40, 60, 75, 80 meters, nighttime band openings will continue to improve. And no matter where we are in the solar cycle, 20 meters will always provide long range band openings all over the country and regularly around the world. 20 meters is rather reliable when it comes to talking across the big pond and other areas worldwide. And I've sat in my truck and I've made contacts on 20 meters into Spain and Italy, which is pretty cool, I think. Any rate, there's still some debate as to whether we're still in cycle 24 or just beginning 25. Um, there's some indications from NASA that we are in cycle 25 right now, and it'll peak in the next few years. So, sunspots are temporary cold regions on the surface of the sun, somewhat like bubbles on the surface of a vat of boiling spaghetti sauce. And they emit lots of ultraviolet radiation, which is primarily responsible for creating an active ionosphere. And so, hams are happy when there are a lot of sunspots. The frequency of sunspots varies with the solar cycle. When there are a lot of sunspots, the high bands 20, 17, 15, 12, 10, and 6 meters come alive. While during the down times, the low bands are the only bands suitable for long distance communications. But there are always exceptions, so don't put too much stock in the sunspot numbers alone. Get on the air and see what's there. And if you don't hear anything, you can always call CQ, but not before checking to see if the band is clear or the frequency is clear. Yep, it is cool, definitely. We find recurring skywave conditions about every 28 days as the sun makes a complete rotation. Ham operators carefully monitor solar activity and find that stronger sunspots may reappear 28 days later for more excitement on the airwaves. That kind of solar activity is also responsible for the aurora borealis as well. So we talk about the number of sunspots. So as we begin our downward slide on the 11-year cycle, we will see less skywave activities on VHF 6 and HF 10 and 12 meters. 15 might be good daytime skywave band, and 20 meters will always stay open around the country and world until darkness begins. That's one thing about 20 meters. It just kind of up and disappears around time that the sun sets. But if you want to get up early and enjoy 20 meters to Europe on special mornings, high sunspot activity enhances long distance communication in the upper HF and lower VHF range. 15 meters, I tell you, getting up early in the morning, if you want to get some 15-meter activity, that's the best time to get on. And you can definitely get some good communications out of 15 meters in the wee early morning hours, because the sun is over the ocean and we're just getting into daylight, and it can be quite exciting and fun. Okay. Moving right along here. As we begin to enter those few years of low solar activity, we won't hear much skywave activity on those bands 6, 10, 12, and 15, but no problem. Again, switch to 20 meters during the days or 40 and 75 at night, and enjoy predictable good skywave DX without the noise that sometimes elevated solar activity brings. And if you have a 160-meter antenna, you want it at least a quarter wave above ground to get some really good ground wave communications. Otherwise, 160 meters is just going to kind of bounce off and come down in close proximity. Being maybe, a couple hundred miles away. The solar flux index is measured daily on the 10.7 centimeter in Ottawa, Canada. Excuse me. So you may tune into the radio propagation solar activity reports transmitted. Stand by. I've just been having a horrible time with my throat this evening. Okay, you may tune in to the radio propagation solar activity reports transmitted by WWV at 18 minutes past the hours. Those frequencies are right on the dot of 10 and 15 megahertz. You'll get best reception during the day. 5 megahertz will give you best reception at night. But they're at 5, 10, and 15. Come on. Change. There we go. Okay, Earth is surrounded by a magnetosphere that acts as a barrier protecting us from some of the charged particles coming from the eruptions on the sun. The magnetosphere occasionally develops holes and cracks that may allow tremendous amounts of solar energy to disturb our natural geomagnetic stability. So some of the energy that penetrates the magnetosphere can be seen as auroras, and a low K index means good, stable, high-frequency propagation. Yay. So that's what your K index indicates. Next, we have the A index. The A index is a 24-hour averaging of the planetary K index and is a great indicator of long-term stability of the Earth's geomagnetic field. Will your Baofeng handle 20-meter bands? No. I presume you're talking about your little handheld Baofeng, and it doesn't cover those frequencies. Okay. Yeah, it's just strictly VHF and UHF. Which one do you have? Do you have the 5? Let's see, which I have one here. I have the Baofeng UV. What is it? I think it's a UV5R. Yep. Yep. No, you won't be able to pick up 20 meters or any HF bands on there. It does have a very wide receiver. You can pick up the FM broadcast band on it and press that little button on the side or one of these buttons somewhere. There's a button to get the FM stations, a little orange button, yeah. No, you're gonna need an HF capable radio. I take it that you probably do not have one at the moment. Okay. I know there's you can probably I tell you my recommendation as far as getting an HF rig is concerned, you can get some fairly good deals at a ham fest. Establish about how much you want to spend because they can be a little pricey if you buy a new one, upwards to about 900 bucks, 1,000, 12, 1,300, something like that, depending on what you want and depending on your budget. But on the used market, a lot you can find some fairly decent rigs for under $500. Yeah, they are rather expensive. I'll tell you, if you go and look on, there's a website called Universal Radio. I'll put that link in right here. Let me get that link right now. I'll put it right in chat. Okay. I'm not seeing it. I lost it. Okay. I'm just going to type it in and there we go. Okay. There's the link to Universal Radio. They do have a selection of used equipment. Matter of fact, let me just kind of pull that over here just to kind of show you what they have here. They have an online catalog. Your amateur base stations, they have a nice little list of them here. And Alinco makes one that really isn't too expensive. This one is 500 bucks, brand new. It's a very, very small radio. It has some fair features to it. It only covers 160 to 10 meters, and it also has 60 meters on the USA version. Put some memories in it and things like that. As far as specifications, it should have about 100-watt transmit, I do believe. Transmitter. Single sideband, CW, FM, 100-watt on high, 10-watt on low. If you're doing AM, it's 40 watts, blah, blah, blah. So Alinco is not really a bad radio to get. It is kind of a lower end type HF radio, but it'll get you on the air, definitely. And here's their other one. That's about 600, almost 670 bucks. They've got QRP or low power transceivers. There's one from Com Radio. The ICOM 7300. Let me kind of close this down a little bit, kind of bring it in. This is actually a software-defined radio, but it gives you a tactile feel of a regular radio. The list price is 1,700. They have this price crossed out. They're offering an instant discount and a rebate. So really the net price for this radio has come down to 1,039.95. And if we go to, however, if you really want to go full blown, now it also depends too. Do you want to operate? Do you want to be just limited to 6 meters, or do you want also 2 meters and 440 on it? The ICOM 706 that I have covers 160 through 70 centimeters. So I have most of the bands on there up to UHF. And you'll see that Yaesu is offering some here too, 160 through 70 meters. Uh, and you can really get, oh, they don't have a price on this one yet. Oh my goodness. See if they have a price on the 3000. Hey, they're only selling that for 1500. Wow. Nice. Tell you one that I would really like to have personally is this one here. And that's 1,400 bucks, brand new. That's the Kenwood TS590SG. Anyway, I wanted to show you here real quick that there is used equipment. Where is it? Complete used list. And you just have to go right down this list and see what's available. They don't have a whole lot of HF gear here, but they do have some. And a lot of this stuff is different types of things, not necessarily ham radio related. But you can go through here and you can look at the list and see what they have. Again, a ham fest is a good place to go to get some good bargains. Okay, back to our Skywave excitement. We've covered this. The A index is a 24 averaging of the K index and an indicator of long-term stability of the geomagnetic field. So, ultraviolet radiation travels at the speed of light. So, it takes about 8 minutes for sunlight and ultraviolet rays to reach the Earth's ionosphere. And heavy sunspot activity may affect worldwide propagation for up to 3 days. Now we're talking about a geomagnetic storm. So, above our weather layer of the atmosphere, called the troposphere, is the ionosphere with its D layer, and above that, the E layer, and then on top of the E layer are the F1 and F2 layers. But there is yet another layer up around 400 miles called the magnetosphere, where the sun sends out a coronal mass ejection. The charged particles may interact with our magnetosphere and disrupt high frequency communications for several days. That's called a geomagnetic storm. Okay, so there's a sudden effect on the ionosphere, and the low bands, such as 160, 80, 40, and even 20 meters, become so noisy that it's impossible to hear any distant signals coming in from sky waves during a sudden ionospheric disturbance. I tell you, I have been on those bands on days where we have that disturbance, and the noise level is like S9 and sometimes above. And only the loudest and the strongest signals will you hear. You won't hear that weak station if it's down in the noise level. And no amount of filtering, no amount of adjusting will clear it up for you. It just doesn't work. All right, let's move along here. We're running out of time. So the lower band, such as, or no, we already did that one. During periods of major geomagnetic disturbances, high frequency propagation over high latitude paths will be degraded. At the same time, activity on 6 meters VHF might be hopping. And during periods of high geomagnetic activity, beautiful auroras may be viewed at night away from city lights as far south as latitude 37 north. The aurora itself is created when gases in the our upper atmosphere are bombarded by coronal mass ejections, kind of like a neon light. Depending on which which gas gets stirred up determines what color our northern lights are going to be seen. So, a trip to Alaska during the equinox will usually lead to some awe inspiring northern lights viewing. You will definitely be impressed by an aurora. The aurora can also reflect VHF signals, adding to the excitement. And there's a picture of it. We can see a sunspot in the amount of time it takes light to travel from the sun to Earth, 8 minutes, but this question asks about slower moving sunspot charged particles. Sunspot charged particles that lumber toward Earth as part of the solar wind, and this wind can take as long as 20 to 40 hours to begin to disturb radio wave propagation on the ham bands. So, really, you have about 2 days advanced alert that band conditions may be changing. So, tune into WWV at 18 minutes past the hour and listen to the 30-second solar report. So, again, those frequencies for WWV, which may be in jeopardy of going off the air, is 5, 15, and 10 megahertz. All right. Disrupting high frequency communications. A solar coronal hole can be seen as a dark spot on the face of the sun, emitting charged particles into the solar wind. You can actually track these sunspots as they rotate around the sun on a 27.5-day cycle. And they're usually a pair of sunspots. One is positive magnetic north field, and the other with a negative south field. Um, I don't know. I guess Galileo kind of found this out. He first observed the sunspots in 1610. So, sunspots with a solar coronal hole will normally disrupt HF communications, but it can also create some very interesting stuff on 6 and 2 meters. All right. So you were told 20 meters will always be the fun band for daytime skywave activity, no matter where we are on the solar cycle. But at night, when 20 meters fades out, turn the band switch to 40 meters, dodge the foreign broadcast carriers, and work the world into the daybreak the next morning. So with the general ham class ticket, the world of Skywave DX is yours to enjoy on all ham bands. Here we go. Any questions before we get into the questions? All right. Well, we're almost at. Okay, good. Yeah, 2025. This won't take long to go through, I don't think. So we'll get started here. Okay, why is the F2 region mainly responsible for the longest distance radio wave propagation? And the easy answer to this is because, remember, we start at the D layer, E layer, F layers, and F2 being the highest ionospheric region can give you the longest distance radio wave propagation. So, what is the approximate maximum distance along the Earth's surface that is normally covered in one hop using the F2 region? And we pretty much covered this. Just kind of think back, it's about 2,500 miles, 2,500 miles. So, where on Earth do ionospheric layers reach their maximum height? Okay, these are the ionospheric layers when they reach their maximum height. And again, we just think of high noon. If you think of height and think of high noon, it's when the sun is pretty much overhead. So, what does the term critical angle mean as used in radio wave propagation? Okay, remember this is about skimming off the Earth, the skimming stone, and everything. You got that critical angle, so you really want to um, think about the highest takeoff angle that will return a radio wave to the Earth under specific conditions. So, what does MUF stand for? And we pretty much covered that. We know that's maximum usable frequency for communications between 2 points. What usually happens to radio waves with frequencies below the MUF and above the LUF when they're sent into the ionosphere? So, there is an effect that radio waves incur below the MUF and above the LUF. They're usually bent back to Earth. So, what is a reliable way to determine if the MUF is high enough to support skip propagation between your station and a station uh, distant loc- located distance between 14 and 30 megahertz? What is a reliable way to determine the MUF? Um, right away, C and D seems so stupid to even put in there. B, you're not. How's sending dots going to do that? Again, you have those beacon stations, so A is the correct answer. Listen for signals from an international beacon in the frequency range you plan to use. They're very handy, those beacon stations. So, which of the following applies when selecting a frequency for lowest attenuation when transmitting on HF? Okay, you want a frequency that has the lowest attenuation in the atmosphere. And so you want to select that frequency just below the MUF. So, what factor or factors affect the MUF? Remember, the MUF is affected by path, distance, and location. It can be affected by the time of day and even the season, your solar radiation, and ionospheric disturbances. All of these are correct. So, what is the approximate maximum distance along the Earth's surface that is normally covered in one hop using the E region? Again, that E region is approximately half of what the F region does. So we're looking around 1,200 or 1,200 miles approximately in that region, that area. So, which of the following is a good indicator of the possibility of skywave propagation on the 6 meter band? Well, if you listen in on the 10-meter band, remember there is a short skip skywave propagation on the 10-meter band, and that may indicate that 6 meters is about to open up. So, which ionospheric layer is closest to the surface of the Earth? Remember that that layer that we have with F2 being the highest. It just stands to reason that D is going to be the closest. That darn D layer. Which of these layers is the most absorbent of long skip signals during daylight hours on frequencies below 10 megahertz? That again, it's that darn D layer. It's going to suck up the signal. Why is long distance communication on 40, 60, 80, and 160-meter bands more difficult during the day? Because we just had the answer in the previous question. That darn D layer is going to absorb or suck those frequencies right out of the atmosphere in the daylight hours. So, what does LUF stand for? Uh, Again, that has just the opposite basically of the MUF, and it's going to be the lowest usable frequency for communication between 2 points. You have a maximum or an upper usable and a lower usable frequency. So what usually happens to radio waves with frequencies below the LUF? Um, we're talking about that absorption layer again, so they get completely absorbed by the ionosphere, anything below the lowest usable frequency. When we're talking about the maximum usable frequency and the lowest usable frequency, there's that section in there that the highest frequency you're going to have, and you want to come down just below that for good communications, and you want to stay above the lowest usable frequency. So, what happens to HF propagation when the LUF exceeds the MUF? Okay, a little bit of a different thing happens here, and it can greatly affect your skywave communication. Um, it's not enhanced. There's not a double hop propagation, and propagation of the path on all HF frequencies is not enhanced. So really, it's no HF radio frequency will support ordinary skywave communications over the path. So what type of wave propagation allows a signal to be detected at a distance too far for ground wave propagation, but too near for normal skywave propagation? Remember, we talked about how you needed to turn your antenna a little bit if you have a beam antenna, and you get a little bit of a different angle and you get a little bit of a scatter or backscatter, basically. In this case, they're going to call it scatter. So that's the type of radio wave you're going to get as a scatter signal. So, why are HF scatter signals in the skip zone usually very weak? Again, that is actually going to come through some um, different different paths are going to be involved in this, but there's going to be less energy in those paths, and so only a small part of the signal energy is scattered into that skip zone. What makes HF scatter signals often sound distorted? And we just talked about how the energy is scattered into the zone through several different radio wave paths. So D is your answer on this. Which of the following might be an indication that signals heard on the HF bands are being received via scatter propagation? Um, if let's see, looking at this, C almost seems like the right answer, but it is not because the signal is heard on a frequency above the maximum usable frequency. So, what is a characteristic of HF scatter signals? They have literally a wavering sound. They sound odd, they're kind of weak, and they waver in and out. So, which of the following describes an azimuthal projection map? Uh, this is a map, of course, that gives you certain bearings to certain areas so that you can turn your beam antenna to the correct direction. So it shows a true bearing and distances from a particular location. How might skywave signal sound if it arrives at your receiver by both short path and long path propagation? Well, you're going to hear the short one first and the long one second. So you might hear a very well defined echo in that case. And you might turn your beam around to the long path to see if you get a um, better reception too. And how is a directional or beam antenna pointed when making a long path contact with another station? Your short path is in one direction, your long path is going to be in the opposite direction. So you're really going to turn 180 degrees around. Simple stuff. Approximately how long is the typical sunspot cycle? Okay. Remember, it peaks about every 11 to 12 years. So D is your correct answer on this. The cycle peaks every 11 to 12 years. It can vary a little bit. Sometimes they can be a little shorter, sometimes they can be a little bit longer. And that's why there's still been a contention for the past couple of years. Are we still at the bottom end of 20? Because I tell you, the propagation has just really been sucky the past couple of years. So that's why there's been a little bit of contention as to whether we're still on the bottom end of 24 or beginning up on 25. Again, NASA, I think, has called it and said that we're probably about a year at least into Sunspot Cycle 25. So over the next uh, 4 or 5 years, we should be peaking in that cycle. And it's not going to be a very strong cycle as the prediction goes, but we're going to get into the peak of that. It will last about 2 or 3 years, and then it's going to start its downward slide, and that'll end the 11-year cycle. So, what is the significance of the sunspot number with regard to HF propagation? The significance of the sunspot number with regard to HF propagation. So if you have low sunspot numbers, does not indicate a probability of sporadic E necessarily, okay? And zero sunspot, none of those. Actually, B and C are not correct, but A is correct. So higher sunspot numbers generally indicate a greater probability of good propagation at higher frequencies. So lots of sunspots, great propagation. What causes HF propagation conditions to vary periodically in a 28-day cycle? Uh, Again, the sun does rotate. It's been discovered that it does rotate. So the sun's rotation on its axis uh, will cause your propagation conditions to vary in a 28-day cycle. What effect do high sunspot numbers have on radio communications? Um, The long distance communication in the upper HF and lower VHF range is enhanced. So high sunspot numbers, the upper HF region, we're talking about, getting into 15, 12, 10 meters and even 6 meters. And in some cases, 2 meters will be enhanced when you have a higher sunspot number. Which of the following are least reliable for long distance communications during periods of low solar activity? This is pretty simple. They are not very reliable. Again, I just kind of named them. They were 15, 12, and 10 meters. So when you have low solar activity, those bands are pretty much almost dead unless you have sporadic E or some anomalous ionospheric condition happen. And then it's only open for a short period of time. So, what is the solar flux index? the the solar sun flux is really a measure of the solar radiation at 10.7 centimeters. Um, so, I'm guessing that's a frequency they're talking about. What does the K index indicate? Now, again, the K index is part of that magnetic field stability. So it actually indicates the short term stability of the Earth's magnetic field. That's the K index. Conversely, the A index, again, kind of takes the average or the long term stability of the Earth's geomagnetic field. Approximately, how long does it take the increased ultraviolet and X-ray radiation from solar flares to affect radio propagation on the Earth? How long does it take the increased ultraviolet and X-ray radiation from solar flares to affect radio propagation on Earth. Remember, it takes about 8 minutes for sunlight to hit the Earth, and it's also the same for the ultraviolet light as well. So, what is a geomagnetic storm? Uh, this again, the geomagnetic storm, just the word magnetic, is going to affect the magnetosphere of the Earth. So, it's a temporary disturbance in the Earth's magnetosphere. D is your correct answer. And what effect does a sudden ionospheric disturbance have on the daytime ionospheric propagation of HF radio waves? It definitely does a disruption, um, and it does that to lower frequencies more than those on higher frequencies. So the lower frequencies, of course, being down around 40 and 80, sometimes 20, but 160 meters. All right. Which of the following effects can a geomagnetic storm have on radio propagation? Again, it's going to degrade your high latitude HF propagation. What is a possible benefit to radio communications resulting from periods of high geomagnetic activity? Um, it's talking about a specific benefit here, and it has to do with VHF signals. And if you recall, when those aurora borealises come up, they can reflect VHF signals. So, how long does it take charged particles from a coronal mass ejection to affect radio propagation on the Earth? Well, depending, it can be a day or two. So, we're looking at 20 to 40 hours. How are radio communications usually affected by the charged particles that reach the Earth from the solar coronal holes? How are they usually affected? Well, HF communications are definitely disturbed. At what point in the solar cycle does the 20-meter band usually support worldwide propagation during daylight hours? Remember, 20 meters is pretty much there all the time. So, at any point in the solar cycle. All right. And that brings us to the end of this. I'm going to stop sharing here and close that up. So, there we have it. If anyone has any questions, just drop me an email at wayne at n3lms.net. And I'm going to go ahead and we'll stop the broadcast here. And I'm going to take questions from our live participants.